think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying that you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying that you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying that you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far as giving free cigarettes to psychiatric facilities.
It's essentially a big bully preying on the weak.
The consequences of this targeting are horrific. People with mental health or substance abuse issues account for 40% of the cigarettes smoked in the United States. And this is one of the leading reasons that people with mental illness die about 5 years earlier than those without.
I'm livid. It's sick. It's twisted.
You're just gonna have to stand up to make the change.
Don't give up. Don't give up the fight.
Know the truth, spread the truth, finish it. Do you think that tobacco companies targeted people with mental health issues?
If you look back through the documents, they go after people with mental illness, people with depression, people with anxiety. You have this subversive marketing saying that you have a problem and we have a solution.
Because you see that it's considered normal or okay, and that's where I would turn to cigarettes and be like, oh, I'm stressed out, so let me smoke a cigarette.
It's despicable.
Big Tobacco went as far.
Yep, you're there. Oh, I see. You're on.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Get everybody seated. We have a great program for you. I'm Robin Koval. I'm the president and CEO of Truth Initiative, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to the beautiful museum. I especially want to extend a welcome to our young guests here today. You'll see them around the room. There are students from Below Pierce Middle School, and we're so happy to have them joining us here today. They are, of course, the future of our work. In addition to those of you who are joining us here in Washington, I also want to welcome an online audience that we've drawn from communities across the U.S. who share an interest in learning about the ways we can eliminate tobacco-related health disparities in our country. We're here today because many people think the tobacco epidemic is solved, but we know that couldn't be further from the truth. There are 37 million Americans who still smoke, and sadly, tobacco is not an equal opportunity killer. There are huge disparities in who still smokes and why. The tobacco crisis in our nation has morphed really into two distinct stories. One of dramatic progress that many of you in this room and those of you on the phone can take great pride in. You've contributed to it. But also one of a huge swath of our country left behind, which we've termed Tobacco Nation. And it's also the title of the report I'll top line for you now. Tobacco Nation is comprised of 12 contiguous states with the highest adult smoking prevalence in the country. It stretches from Michigan to Mississippi, from West Virginia to Oklahoma. And these states, when combined, have statistics on par or higher than some of the least developed countries in the world, which is pretty shocking. And we're not talking about a few people. Tobacco Nation includes more than 66 million people. That's equal to the size of the UK, of France, of Thailand. It's 20% of our population. And it's also the home to 13.2 million young people, and that's why we need to care about it. When you compare Tobacco Nation to countries with a fraction of our financial, scientific, healthcare resources, its smoking prevalence ranks among the 5th worst places, 4th for youth smoking, in the world, alongside places like the Philippines or Indonesia or Brazil. And we don't usually think of our country that way. Smokers in Tobacco Nation smoke more, they live shorter lives, and they're more likely to get and die from cancer than the rest of the US and many parts of the world. Further compounding this problem is the relative lack of smoke-free laws and other tobacco control policies designed to protect the public and encourage cessation. And here's the thing that really I think we should be upset about. The US was once considered a leader and a beacon for the world in tobacco control, and now we are falling behind. So it should come as no surprise that one of the major international tobacco companies recently declared, and this is a quote, they see the US as an exciting opportunity for long-term growth. That's shocking. Reducing tobacco disparities will require a serious effort. And our discussion today will focus on raising awareness of the existence of Tobacco Nation and devising strategies to deeply impact the states and communities most impacted by the epidemic. Our moderator today for the Warner series is William Wan. William is a national roving correspondent for the Washington Post. He joined the Post in 2005 as a Metro reporter and was part of the Pulitzer finalist team for coverage of the Fort Hood shootings. And most recently, William has covered the hurricanes affecting the U.S. and Puerto Rico and the recent tragedy in Las Vegas. So we're very pleased that William was able to join us today. A few months ago, some of you may remember that William wrote a very impactful article for the Post, which delved into America's new tobacco crisis and inspired us to undertake this research shared in the Tobacco Nation report. In his article, William stated, this is a quote, "Hidden among the steady declines in recent years is the stark reality that cigarettes are becoming a habit of the poor. The national smoking rate has fallen to historic lows with just 15% of adults still smoking, but the socioeconomic gap has never been bigger. During the discussion today, we'll take an in-depth look at the topics covered in our report and William's article and what we can do to end the tobacco crisis and its disparities for good. Before William kicks off and introduces our panel, I just want to ask our Washington, D.C. and online audiences to remember this is a dialogue, and we encourage your participation. Those who are watching online can submit questions throughout the event. Please post them to our Twitter and Facebook accounts using the hashtag #WarnerSeries. And please include your name and affiliation along with your question. We'll also open the microphones for audience questions at the end after our discussion, and we welcome you to share your insights via social media. If you do, please remember it's the Truth Initiative handle, #WarnerSeries. So now let's give you something to tweet about. It's my pleasure to turn the program over to William and our panel, and thank you very, very much for being here today.
Good afternoon, or good morning. I'm William Wan. I'm a science correspondent for the Washington Post. And I just want to say thank you to all of you for being here. And thanks especially to our panelists for being here. And I'm really excited about the discussion, partly for selfish reasons. As a reporter, you spend a lot of time trying to figure out the right people to talk to, and then often you have to spend a lot more time convincing them to talk to you. And to have 4 people stuck on a stage and free reign to ask any questions and make them answer it is quite a treat for me. So I appreciate that. And so how I arrived myself at this topic we're talking about today is over the past year I've been writing a series of stories about smoking in America, who smokes in America still and why. And so in my travels, one thing that continually really shocked me, I would go to these rural parts of America. This is like Arkansas, Kentucky, West Virginia, and I would realize just how different these parts of America are from the parts I'm used to. You know, I worked in Baltimore, Washington, big cities. And so one woman especially just has stayed in my mind the last few months. Her name was Debbie Seals. She is a smoking cessation expert. She travels to try to help people to quit smoking, to give it up after smoking their whole life. And I spent a few days with her, and it just was so wrenching watching her kind of slam her head against the wall. And she would, over and over every day, she had this little tiny compact car that she would drive to the farthest reaches of West Virginia. This is up in the mountains, out all through rural Virginia as well. And she would talk to these people and try to help them in their own life to slowly get through quitting. And there would be people that she had been trying to help do this for 6 years. For 6 years, every year they would go to her classes. Every year they would try to quit. And every year they'd be back to like 3 packs a day. And one woman we visited, her walls she had smoked so much over the years, so intensely that the walls of her kitchen were stained yellow. They were painted white and stained yellow. And she described to us how she would try to just wash with every kind of chlorine and bleach just to get the color out of her walls, and she couldn't. And to watch this woman, go to all of these places, then that would be her weekday job. And on the weekend, she would drive up to the suburbs of Washington, to Arlington, where she had grandkids. And she would see not a person smoking on the street. She would see young, healthy couples jogging to Whole Foods to buy their organically grass-fed, free-range eggs and beef. And so the comment she made to me that really stuck in my head was, it's like there's 2 worlds now. It's as if America is this restaurant where there's this non-smoking section and a smoking section, and the people who keep getting more and more shoved into the smoking section are poor, often minorities, often living in rural sections of America. And so these divisions of America, it's not just rich getting richer and poor getting poorer, but the poor more and more becoming the concentrated people who smoke in America. anyways, that's how I arrived at where I am in terms of doing these stories on smoking. And so I'm really intrigued by this report Truth has put out on the Tobacco Nation, because it's just this very simple idea that there's 12 contiguous states in US where this is where we're more and more shoving all the smokers in our country. And as it becomes more and more concentrate, this problem becomes harder to tackle. So I thought I'd start with a bunch of questions for our panelists, and then we'll open it up to any of you as well to ask questions. But first I want to introduce, we have with us Dr. Corinne Graffunder. She's director of CDC's Office on Smoking Health. She's worked more than 25 years, I think, in policy and public health, with a lot of experience of that in smoking as well. And we have Dr. Viswanath. I hope I'm Viswanath.
I've been called all kinds.
He's professor of health communication at the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Harvard's School of Public Health. And a lot of his work has focused on the relationship between communication and poverty and disparity and health disparities. And then we have Alana Knudsen, and she is the principal research scientist and co-director of Walsh Center for Rural Health Analysis at NORC. She's well-versed in the challenges of health, especially when it comes to the rural areas, which is where a lot of this problem is. And last we have Tracy Strader. And she's former director of Oklahoma's Tobacco Settlement Endowment Trust, and now consultant and liaison for Oklahoma Tobacco Research Center. Yeah. And I thought I'd just start out with a question for you, Corinne, just about, open-ended of just how do we get to where we are now in this country in terms of smoking, and what does the latest CDC data say about current tobacco trends, where this is headed?
Thank you, William, and thank you for your reporting, and also thank you to Truth Initiative for having me here today. I have to say, I was sharing with Robin that as someone who comes from a data-oriented organization where, we believe data should always drive decision-making, and we also believe that those data that are most powerful are those data that are used, it was extremely rewarding to see the Truth Initiative's report, Tobacco Nation, and the use of those data that are completely consistent with our data. Some of the data are ours, but there are other data that are completely consistent with the data that we report on, and certainly we've continued to put out reports and data-related research on the kinds of disparities that we're talking about. There are a couple of things I thought I would highlight for you all this morning. We have 4 strategic priorities in the Office on Smoking and Health. The first one is to prevent the initiation of tobacco use. And I think it is important because to remember, as has already been said, that we have always got to understand what the tobacco dynamic looks like within our youth and our young population, our youth and young adults. In part because we know that nicotine is highly addictive, and we know that no young person should really be using any form of tobacco. That being said, what our data do show us is that yes, while cigarette use has declined substantially among youth, we still see 1 in 5 high school students that when you ask them about their tobacco use, they will report in the last 30 days using at least 1/5 will report having used one form of tobacco, and of that group, almost 50% will report in the last 30 days having used more than one form of tobacco. So we have reason to be complimentary and feel good about the success that we've had amongst young people, but we also have reason to remain concerned and remain vigilant around the monitoring, right? So we want to continue to monitor and understand the situation as it continues to evolve. So that's our first strategic area. The second strategic area is cessation, and just exactly what you just said, and that cessation and quitting in this country, we have not been as successful in seeing quitting increasing in the same way that we've seen initiation decreasing. We've seen some recent success, but really quitting behavior in this country had been flat for a very, very long time. So we know quitting is hard. We know, and I think in your story, that in your report and related to the story that you just shared, there was also discussion of that same woman who had tried so many times not being able to sit with her colleagues or sit with her coworkers at lunch because they were all smoking during lunch. So it reinforces the idea that smoke-free environments, smoke-free workplaces, smoke-free policies, and as the report points out, those are absent in many, or insufficient in many of these states that are part of the Tobacco Nation. Those really help support cessation and they help support smokers. And we know 70% of current smokers want to quit smoking, and they consistently report that. The third area for us, I've already mentioned, is smoke-free. Again, it's an area that when you go to Arlington, when you go to the places that many of us live and work, we do see the success that we've been able to accomplish. 60% of the US population today is in fact covered by comprehensive smoke-free policy, and that means restaurants, bars, and workplaces. But what did I just say? 60% of the US population is covered. That means 40% of the US population remains uncovered by comprehensive smoke-free. And what we do know, and again, the report speaks to this, and the data is sufficient to understand this, that it is the vulnerable populations. It's young minority children who live in multi-unit housing and rental housing. It's, again, workplaces that are not providing sufficient coverage for comprehensive smoke-free. The last area that we prioritize, our last strategic priority area is in fact exactly why we're here today. It's to address the disparities that we see in tobacco use and tobacco control, quite honestly. And I have a slide here that I'll ask that they pull up. Really, this slide is designed to complement what is shared in the report. The report talks about the geography, so the states that are the highest, have high prevalence, and the geography of those states. But we also know that we have population groups and populations that are at high risk. And so you can see on this slide that when you look at race and ethnicity, when you look at education levels, which was just mentioned, when you look again at poverty status, when you look at insurance coverage, we know coverage is better than it was, but it's still insufficient, and certainly coverage is not all of that equation. We need to not only cover, but then also ensure that access is being made available. Disabilities, sexual orientation, and then serious psychological distress are all part of how we understand the populations. There's a lot of really great data in tobacco control, and again, the greatest thing of all is to see people that are actually using it and making meaningful action come from that.
That's helpful. And Tracy, I wanted to ask you a little bit about what this looks like on the ground, how it plays out in the work that you've done in Oklahoma especially. Yeah.
So in Oklahoma, we have a pretty conservative frontier culture, and passing policies, for example, smoke-free policies or increasing the price of tobacco products are very difficult things to achieve en masse. And we have had some success, for example, in smoke-free. Most of our restaurants are completely smoke-free, most of our workplaces, and now all of our school districts are smoke-free. But we've had to do so much of that sort of one business at a time, one city government making its own property smoke-free, one school district at a time. So where we've gotten quite a bit of buy-in, it has taken a lot more time and a lot more resources to get even the progress we've made so far than if we had passed really effective policy early on. We would have saved so many lives, so much time, so many resources had we passed those policies. So at the same time, I think we really have to convince people of the importance of these policies. A policy approach to changing a behavior, if you will, or an addiction like this is counterintuitive for people. You just talk to somebody on the street and say, well, we're just going to raise the price of the product. And they'll say, well, kids can buy, expensive shoes and so forth. But it's that, that cheap prices We have a great deal of poverty in our state. We have low educational attainment, and all of that comes with a lack of control, high stress, and supportive environments that keep people smoking. So we've made a lot of strides through what we would call voluntary policy, and we've even made some strides in public policy, but it has been much slower. In Oklahoma, we've been really fortunate because once the Master Settlement Agreement occurred in our state, we created an endowment. So we put that money to work creating earnings, creating revenue, and then that has supported the programs that we've implemented for all of these years. And as a result, I would say, when I first saw Tobacco Nation described as those 12 contiguous states, I thought, not anymore. Oklahoma has moved out of that prevalence range, and South Carolina's come up, and North Dakota's come up. But the reality is Oklahoma is still part of Tobacco Nation. We have those cultural values. We have those same barriers and obstacles. And, if you think about it, in our state in particular, we have in recent years not done a really good job of investing in education and investing in the sorts of things that give people the opportunities to make healthy choices. So on many levels in our state, we've really suffered. The last thing I'll mention, this really is an issue of socioeconomic status by and large, but for example, we have a huge problem with behavioral health disorders in Oklahoma. And I love the way our commissioner of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services talks about it, is she says, the brain is an organ of the body. And we as a population in Oklahoma are not healthy as it is. Why would we think our brains would be any different than our hearts or our livers or any other organ that we have? If we're not attending to our total health picture, then our brains are going to suffer. And I can tell you that on our Oklahoma Tobacco Helpline, our quit line in our state, we have a very well-funded, very robust service offering, and we serve close to 40,000 people every single year. 50% of all of our participants report having a diagnosed mental health or substance abuse disorder. So, and of course, we know the smoking prevalence in this population is extremely high. The other thing we have in Oklahoma, besides just sort of that very individual frontier culture, is we also have 39 federally recognized tribal headquarters in our state. So while we're a small state, a population of 3.8 million, we have the second highest number of American Indians in our state than any other. And that is a wonderful asset that we have in our state, but the cultural significance of tobacco in sacred or ceremonial traditional use runs very deep. So there's a lot of efforts from within the tribes to address tobacco among their people, and I think really realizing the devastating impact it has on the health, on their economics, and the very culture of their population. So we work together, but we have to recognize that these tribes are sovereign nations. So it's like the state of Oklahoma trying to do business with England, for example. You can't just pass a state law and make that apply. And I have to give great credit to many of the tribes that have made great strides in either increasing their own taxes, making their own properties smoke-free. They have a long way to go, but we're all making those incremental strides. Unfortunately, it's slow.
When you talk about resistance, what can you describe, what is the connection between the culture or ethos of Oklahoma or states like that and resistance? What do you often hear from lawmakers when you're doing lobbying, advocacy? And what do you hear from individual smokers/voters, regular people when you try to gain support for these kinds of regulations? Yeah.
Well, the lawmakers will often say something like, I just hate tobacco, and if you brought me a law today that would outlaw it, I would sign it. That's kind of an easy out, because that's not likely to happen. Many of them, most of them, have either signed the no tax pledge or have that belief system. So, it's really difficult sometimes to convince them that a tobacco tax is different than other taxes. And I really love the idea now. I mean, there's so many new sort of what we would call pricing strategies, that it doesn't always have to be a tax, and I think that's maybe a more culturally relevant way or a way to get there. You know, in terms of smoke-free, while we'd say everybody has a right to breathe smoke-free air, some of our lawmakers will say, but a business owner has a right to make his own decision about what happens in his business, and people can vote with their feet. You know, but that's really a problem for the people who work there. It's a problem for any of the patrons who want to come and so forth. So I think there's just always this balance between individual personal responsibility. We always hear a lot about personal responsibility, and there is truth to that. We do all have a piece in this puzzle. So we hear a lot about personal responsibility, but we also hear of people wanting to make sure that we're not placing undue burden on a business owner, or we're causing them to lose business in any way. Now, I will say the smokers themselves absolutely support most things that we try to do around smoking. I mean, I think most smokers, in our polling and survey data show this, most smokers are happy to accommodate a smoke-free place. They're happy to not smoke in that place, not expose their loved ones or the public. You know, and I would say the non-smokers in our population, I absolutely love having smoke-free environments, but they too start worrying, well, smokers have to have somewhere to go. We need, you know, everybody is more than willing, you know, maybe it's that Southern hospitality, but we're more than willing to acquiesce and try to accommodate people. So balancing all of those factors is a tough challenge.
Alana, I wanted to ask you about, given all your work on rural health, what are the effects of this disparity? So the implications going forward, like as this gap between rich and poor on smoking and geographic gap grows, what does that do for our country, and what are the implications in the future? Yeah.
Well, there are great disparities when you look at rural. And I have a slide that illustrates how the smoking prevalence in rural has not decreased. And in fact, in some of our areas, it has actually increased. And so when you're looking at larger rural communities, and for those of you that come from metropolitan areas, I'm talking large rural areas of 10,000 to 50,000, we've actually seen an increase in the prevalence of smoking over this last decade. There's a slight decrease in the smallest, which we call non-core or frontier, of less than 10,000 people in some of these areas. But clearly, where people live makes a difference. And I will say that one of the biggest challenges we have in rural overall, and I think the report really illustrates that many of the counties in Tobacco Nation are rural. And when you look at the public health infrastructure in our rural communities, it has greatly diminished, particularly over this last decade. And although we look often at population metrics like hitting 60%, the challenge when we're looking at rural communities and looking at rural investments is that that population is smaller. And so when you're looking at, for example, allocating federal funding, as you know, CDC provides federal funding to states, and then states in turn allocate that funding. Well, much of that funding is allocated based on a population formula. So the larger communities will get a larger percentage of those dollars. However, that is really difficult in rural because the infrastructure isn't there. So you get much less funding, which also translates into many fewer opportunities to actually make a positive difference. And I think when we look at rural, and then when you layer race over rural, you'll even see a greater diversity across rural communities. But I think what is particularly disturbing to me in working in rural communities is not only do we consistently see that our adults' smoking prevalence is higher than it was a decade ago, we see that our kids living in our most sparsely populated areas in our rural communities are smoking at twice the percentage of our urban kids. And what does this translate as we go forward? This means that we're going to continue to see these disparities over time, because you know what? We don't do a great job at diminishing those percentages right now in rural. So if we continue to see that same percentage over time, we're going to continue to see higher rates of mortality and morbidity related to the tobacco use. And in addition to smoking, we also see in our rural communities about twice the percentage using chew tobacco. And that is another element that is really critical when you start looking at different types of morbidity and mortality for that population as well. And so there's a number of different types of interventions that have been implemented in rural communities. But clearly, when you're looking at 20% of our country that live in rural areas, we really see huge disparities with the ability to implement programs and have resources to implement programs that are really making a meaningful and impactful difference in that population.
And Vish, I want to draw on your expertise because I feel like the research you do is kind of at the heart of this, is this question, why? Like, why do we make these choices as society, as individuals? And so I'm curious from a behavioral science background, like how did we end up here where we are, and what are the different choices or behaviors that shape how smoking plays out now in America with these disparities? Yeah.
Sure. So when we talk about behavior as a term, I think immediately it connotes a sense of agency, that it is in the control of the individual, and if he or she chooses to, can quit given all the resources and given all the public education. After all, we have been doing this research for 80 years now, going all the way back to Richard Peter and Richard Dahl. So we should know this, right, I think. And so I think that has been the prevailing discourse. But let me contextualize it a bit, I think. So if I were to summarize in a pithy way what others have said, I think behavior takes place in the context of class, place, and race. It's not something that happens within the choice of the individual, though I think I agree that individuals do have a choice, but the day-to-day life in which they live, play, work has a profound influence on what people do and what people don't do. So let us disentangle this a little bit, right? So it's very clear, and the data and the earlier remarks and the data from the Tobacco Nation report demonstrate this as clearly as possible, that those who are poor, those who are in blue-collar industries, working in blue-collar industries or service industries, those who are in the rural areas are much more likely to smoke, right? So that immediately should suggest what is it in the day-to-day life of the people that compels them, impels them, and provides them this direction of addressing some of these day-to-day challenges they face. It is a challenge of micro-humiliations. It's a challenge of micro-situations where they're constantly under stress. One part of it is mental health, but the other part of it is just not mental. That is stress associated with navigating and maneuvering through life. Right? If you think about it, I think it's C. Wright Mills, who wrote about 50 years ago about the sociological imagination. What it suggests is, increasingly we feel that there are larger social forces that are beyond our control which dictate our lives, right? So if you think about a rural area, a one-company town, the decisions about whether the company is sited or located in that place is not made in that town, but somewhere else, somewhere globally. Right, that one particular decision can eliminate 10,000 jobs, 15,000 jobs, 20,000 jobs, right? The large-scale changes that are happening in technology can eliminate jobs just like that because of robotics and other ways of technology. So what it is that people are increasingly under threat, that they will lose their livelihood. When they lose a job, it's just not about means of income. It's about connections to the society. They stop going to the church. They stop going to the bars to meet their friends. They stop joining the bowling leagues, the clubs, as someone has observed, right? It is this connection, this increasing social isolation, that it is more about these conditions of threat, isolation, lack of control, that really impel them to address them in some meaningful way. So some of us can go and, if we feel under, threats of depression and stress, we may be able to afford to go to, high-powered psychiatrists or psychologists or counselors and get the treatment. But not everyone has access to that. right? And this is a particular challenge, I think, So the other side of it is, what we have been talking about is communication inequalities. I think we have been extremely successful. I think the Truth Initiative has shown this, that public education campaigns do work, However, there are differential capacities among people to access this information, to really capacity to process this information and capacity to act on this information. One simple telling example is, if you take rural areas, broadband access in rural areas is a major problem, right? Just imagine our lives without broadband, right? We all do everything very routinely, right? We have these smartphones, the so-called smartphones that I think actually are making us dumb, and we are able to access it and use it, right? However, there are people who cannot pay the bills, data plans, who can't have access to this kind of information, who don't have the signals if you're in rural areas. And I think, Alana talked about this infrastructure in the rural areas, right? As one example, it's just not the rural areas. You go to certain neighborhoods in our cities where there is a systematic deprivation of infrastructure facilities, of investment. Increasingly, we are investing in gentrification, right? Where we are people are under threat, they're being evicted. So how do you cope day in and day out with these kinds of micro threats and micro humiliations? So it is, after all, it is of course a question of behavior, of course a question of choice, but the choice that is nested in a concatenating conditions of social context, of class, race, and place. I think that is one, these are some of the reasons why we have this story after 60 years later, after all these campaigns and work, that we are now facing this where only a certain sections of the people are suffering from this. So just to put it, it's an age-old story. The benefits from our interventions are accruing unequally across class, race, and place.
That's really interesting. And I just wanted to ask all of you. I mean, the thing that really struck me from this report was when they took all 12 of these states and compared it as a country. Like, if these 12 states were a country in itself and compared it to the highest smoking countries in the world, just how badly, these 12 states do as a tobacco nation. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on how did these parts of U.S. get to this point in terms of where we used to be a leader in tobacco control, and now it seems like half of the country, this portion is falling behind. Like, how did we get there, and what, was it a loss of focus or funding or political will? And how do we get back to the point where we have this leading status in terms of tobacco control?
Well, I might start. I certainly can't speak for every state in Tobacco Nation, but I know in Oklahoma, of course, one of the things we have to talk about is the tobacco industry influence. In recent years, so I mentioned we have a state of 3.8 million people. We have anywhere from 12 to 15 lobbyists at our state capitol every session. Oklahoma is somewhat unique. Tennessee's right there with us, though, in that we have what's called preemption. So that's where the tobacco industry back in the 80s had language inserted into many of our laws, which simply says that no local community can pass an ordinance that's stronger than state law. Of course, the tobacco industry loves this, because if they can weaken or dilute or just defeat some strategy that we may have through policy, then because we're preempted at that local level, those 12 to 15 lobbyists only have to spend their time at our state capitol. They don't have to worry about the locals. They don't have to disperse themselves. And so there are deep relationships that form between these lobbyists and these elected officials. In fact, I was reflecting on this the other day, that for many years, we didn't have term limits. And people said, well, this will change if we got term limits. Well, we've had term limits now to the point that some people have termed out after 12 years. And yet these same sorts of deep relationships continue. One of the folks that I work with at our research center did some good study and found that it's actually, it's not even as much as the campaign donations as meals, if you track the meals. So imagine the conversations that go on. I'm saying all of this because we talk a lot about personal responsibility, place, race, and class, rural, and so forth. All of these things matter, and they matter deeply. But most of them wouldn't matter nearly as much if we didn't have that constant attack from the industry. And I mentioned earlier to someone that, you know, we've got evidence from internal industry documents that shows that by 1986 and 1989, and I may get them twisted, but let's say in the mid to late 80s, the tobacco industry defeated in all 50 states efforts for smoke-free policies and efforts to increase the price of tobaccos. That was in the 80s. So many states have done a really good job of counteracting that, others not as well. But I will say, at least for Oklahoma, probably Tennessee, and then some of the other states, if we're battling something like preemption, then, you know, we've got a barrier that's the equivalent of, you know, a huge wall put before us. So that's in part why we've taken that strategy of going sort of city government to city government, school district to school district. I actually had a lawmaker at one point, a session or two ago, say, well, why do we need you all? You know, we're not having any trouble getting this bill passed to make schools smoke-free. And it's like, because we've been working for a decade, like the woman you discussed who'd gone sort of door to door trying to get people to quit. That might work over time if you have enough people like her out in their cars and so forth. But what we find is that strategy is just not the most effective way to get broad-scale change to occur. And our biggest obstacle in policy is really the influence of the tobacco industry. Maybe didn't answer your question fully, but answered it.
Thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing this report has done, which I really applaud Truth Initiative for doing this, is really identifying and characterizing the tobacco problem as a global problem, right? By explicitly drawing that comparison. This industry is extremely agile, very savvy, and their perspective is global. And what they have done is this brilliant combination of global and local at the same time. And I think it goes back to this issue of why is it that, you know, we have these 20 states, a few states, you know, that are experiencing this. So if you think about it, these are also the same states where manufacturing has disappeared or fast living, with plants disappearing. The rural areas have suffered heavily, and where the investment in public health infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure has been eroding steadily as a result of declining tax base. So it's not a problem that has happened overnight, but it is something that we have been observing for the last 20, 25 years. Whereas these other countries with a much more centralized setup are able to take, you know, the kind of steps that they can take with a decentralized setup and a federalism, it becomes that much more difficult for us to take the action. So as I said, even though we may talk about, you know, Appalachia or Ohio or Kentucky individual as states, the industry looks at it in a global perspective, right? You know, and that's how they act. So I can, as I said, you know, if you can deprive employment of an entire county, you know, with one decision made in the offices of Wall Street, you know, affecting this entire county, that I think is more a global problem, right? So I think that's how we have arrived at it. It's not something that happened overnight. The other point I think is Tracy mentioned this notion of policy research. Actually, if you think about where people live their lives, it's in the local communities, in the local neighborhoods. And when they need help with anything, they're not going to the national or state level, but they're actually going to their neighborhoods, to the community-based organizations to seek the help. But that's not where the help is available, because the community-based organizations that work with them, the neighborhood organizations, don't have the resources or the infrastructure to help them, I think. So it's a really an interesting problem that is global and local.
Corinne, can I ask you something? When I was doing my reporting, one line from the CDC's website, from your statistics, especially jumped out at me, and I wanted to try to understand why that is. It was about the when you take poor people and wealthier people that both try to quit at in equal levels, but that the poor are much less likely to be successful at quitting. And I was wondering, what are the factors that go into that? Why is that?
Great, it's a great question. And I'm going to answer it in two ways. The first way is that we absolutely know that, as I've already said, most smokers want to quit. It's a very high rate, 70%. And in fact, over time, research has shown that even smokers with behavioral health issues, with mental health issues, comorbidities, can quit when the right support, the right resources are in place. We have a lot of challenges in terms of ensuring that the right resources and the right support is in place. Certainly, the healthcare sector is not yet at a place where it's really doing what it needs to be doing in terms of, while we have better coverage than we've had in the past in this country, we still do not see access to nicotine replacement therapies, to the counseling, to the kinds of support that smokers who want to quit need to have, and that again, the evidence has shown that can and does often help support them in quitting. That's one piece of it. Providers need to be encouraged, and they need to be educated. Providers need to be educated to support their smoking patients, and then the patients themselves need to be educated in the range of options that they have available. So I think there's a lot more that we can be doing to really understand nicotine addiction and understand sort of chronic condition management, right? And how do you manage and help? We know the more times a smoker tries to quit, the closer they get to someday quitting as well. So we want to continue to encourage and support that behavior. That's one piece of it. The second piece of it, though, and I have a second slide, so thank you for teeing that one up. If you can bring up the slide with the vaccine. At the heart of this for us, we talk about this idea of a tobacco control vaccine. And we use this vaccine analogy because for some reason, for a lot of people, it kind of helps bring it all together. And the way we came to this is that really, my going out and talking to groups, talking to people, being in communities and hearing people say, we're a quick fix society, right? We'd like to just have it not take so long, have it not be so hard, have an easy answer to this problem. And so we just need a vaccine. And so our response is we actually do have a vaccine. We know what works in tobacco control in so many more ways than we do in so many other public health areas. And so the vaccine, as you see, talks about the things you've already heard about: smoke-free, cessation support, tobacco price increases, and hard-hitting media campaigns. The point the vaccine makes that maybe isn't as clear in the dialogue so far is that we would never be satisfied as a society for a partial dose of our flu vaccine, or we would never settle for a time-limited supply of medications for someone who has suffering from hypertension and needs their medication to manage their hypertension. And yet we accept as society this idea that if we help a smoker try to quit, or we encourage them to quit with messaging and with campaigns, that then they should just keep trying and they should ultimately be successful and quit, or else they're a failure as a human being. And what the vaccine, again, tries to convey is that it is not about that person being a failure as a human being. It's, again, about the failure of delivering at a sufficient dosage in combination this entire complement of supports that help someone who wants to quit smoking. So, and again, I go back to your story. So a person living in housing where smoking is permitted, it's harder for that person after working a hard day and after being stressed and not knowing whether they're going to have a job or not, to then go home and be surrounded by an environment where smoking is accepted. The workplace, if it's a smoking workplace, will absolutely support and reinforce that behavior. So it really is, in our sense, it really is this combination of strategies that we have not been able to sufficiently deliver because of the infrastructure, because of the resources. CDC does support all 50 states, but our 50 states, tribes, territories, and the amount of resources that we have available is approximately $50 million to support and address the entirety of the tobacco epidemic across the entirety of the U.S. in every state. I mean, it just is not sufficient, so we rely on partners. We rely on individuals and community action, and really trying to get the not just the messaging around why tobacco use, why smoking is harmful, but we hear through our TIPS campaign and through talking to real smokers and real people, we hear the stories of them sharing that it is not just about you're going to die, because all smokers typically know that they're going to ultimately die, but it's kind of that you're going to die of something, or you look at the data and it's like, well, the difference between, a life expectancy of a smoker versus a non-smoker, well, what's a couple of years, right? So you hear some of that stuff, right? You hear that. So what we also try to make sure is very clear is the consequences, the costs of living with tobacco-related disease. And we've certainly heard that through our TIPS campaign, that it isn't simply about the death, it's about the health-related as well as the economic consequences to either, again, individuals, communities, policymakers, et cetera, quite honestly.
And, Alana, I wanted to ask you, so we've talked a little bit, when it comes to, I want to ask you about rural communities especially, what the challenges are there. So we've talked a little bit about infrastructure, healthcare coverage, policy, difficulties in that. Are there other hurdles when it comes to rural areas? Are there issues of like communication or other things that we're not thinking about that are major stumbling blocks?
So you ask a great question, because I actually grew up in a rural area. In fact, I grew up in a frontier area where there were less than 3 people per square mile. That's quite a bit different than where we are residing right now. And I think one of the things, and I think we've all touched upon it in different ways, is there's a culture. And I think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation really coined that culture of health. And I think it's really important when we think about how we are looking at interventions. And I think one of the things that we have learned in our research as well as our evaluation of programs in rural America is that you can't plug and play necessarily these urban interventions or urban solutions. There is not perhaps the infrastructure. We also talk about the need for behavioral health. We know a lot of people smoke due to anxiety, depression, underlying issues that also contribute to some of their decisions to use tobacco. And so what we have done at the Wall Center for Rural Health Analysis, we have developed a host of different types of toolkits. And we just recently released one on rural tobacco prevention. And we went across the country and asked all kinds of different program implementers what has worked and what are interventions that other rural communities may either adopt or adapt to their particular needs. And I'll give you a few examples. And these are located on a website called the Rural Health Information Hub. They are supported through the Federal Office of Rural Health Policy, the only federal office dedicated to issues regarding rural health in the Department of Health and Human Services. And some of the things that we've found is we need lessons learned where we need to meet people where they are. And that's not a surprise for those of us who have lived our lives in public health. But one of the neat campaigns that we came across was a campaign that talked about tobacco-free hunting. Now, some of you may think that's an interesting marriage, but you know what? It turned out to be very successful. And we have the whole array of how they implemented the program, the different types of resources that they brought to bear. Likewise, there was another program about tobacco-free rodeos. Because as we know in Oklahoma and all kinds of, particularly in the western part of our country, the tobacco industry supports a lot of rodeo-related activities. And so looking at how to partner then with rodeos to try to change that culture and improve that. We also found some really interesting worksite types of interventions, and one happens to be in West Virginia with the Southern Coalfield folks. And they have related workforce health and tobacco-free workplace activities. And they have a campaign called Spit It Out. And it has had tremendous success. And what they have also done is gotten the families involved. Because do you remember our old issues with drinking and driving? Do you remember how that used to be part and parcel? And I can tell you, coming from a rural community, a few years ago, that was not that that was not that unrealistic to find a lot of people. But do you remember what effort changed that? Do you remember when MAD first started, Mothers Against Drunk Driving? That changed the entire culture. And I would suggest we need to think about that from the tobacco standpoint. And I think the Truth Initiative identifies some comprehensive approaches to that, but some of the issues within Tobacco Nation, you're really looking at a culture where this is acceptable. And we have to figure out ways to make health be the acceptable choice. And, you know, as we've talked about, CDC doesn't have enough resources to do that. And one of the things that we do in rural America, I think better than almost any place in the country, is that we partner. We partner with the Truth Initiative. We partner with foundations. We partner with faith-based. For example, there's a wonderful program in the Kentucky, in the Appalachia area of Kentucky, called Move Mountains, and that is an effort to reduce the use of tobacco. And they're drawing upon that faith-based community because that's so important to rural America. And so, you know, looking at how we can leverage some of these incredible partnerships to really make a difference. And lastly, I'll just comment about tribal communities. There's one tribal community that has implemented a program called Keep It Sacred. And again, because that is the tradition of many of our American Indian nations to use tobacco as part of their ceremonies, what this program does is to discourage the commercial use of tobacco while recognizing that important component for their culture. And so I think what we really need to think about is how can we make a difference with the culture and find people and meet people where they are and ask them what makes a difference, rather than implement programs that may or may not resonate with the people who are actually going to hopefully be positively impacted by them.
What you talked a little bit about communication. That's really interesting what you said about Mothers Against Drunk Driving and just thinking in novel ways about approaching the problem. I was curious for Vish or any others, like, are there ways of communicating that that haven't been fully exploited, or that organizations could go stronger towards?
I think, since you asked about communication, let me jump in and say, so some of the examples that have been cited, whether it's MAD or other social movement organizations, one thing social movement organizations do very successfully, the successful social movement organizations, is framing. Right, you know, so how do you really successfully frame? Framing is redefining the issue, right? So there is a certain amount of a tobacco fatigue right now, where people think we have solved the problem. I don't know why we are still talking about tobacco since we have solved the problem, right? And so I think there is a need for a new social movement at the grassroots level, where we have to reframe this issue. I think, you know, so and somehow trying to communicate. Frame is a nice metaphor, right? Framing is a metaphor to communicate in a very pithily, in a successful way, to say that the problem exists, but there is a solution, right? Framing is about problem, defining the problem, and identifying a solution. And I think that's going to be a part of a very successful social movement that we absolutely require. Second is this notion of partnerships. I think the partnerships require a tremendous amount of support. And I can tell you, I think because of the complexity of the information environment, where there are, where there is a tremendous shift in the way people access and use information, we just can't go with a overall national campaign and be happy with it. We have excellent exemplars, so that the Truth campaign, the most recent times, the TIPS campaign, and I think those are successful. But those are far and few between. Those are expensive, that require a tremendous amount of attention and investment by the organizations. But we have to complement that by really encouraging grassroots organizations to also communicate, to also frame these issues for the public, I think. And what this does is actually allows us not to rely only on advertising or public communication campaigns, but also infuse it through news media, through other cultural vehicles that are important, I think. So that's what is required. I think we need a great deal of agility. Everyone goes towards social media, and I don't want to come across as a Luddite who doesn't like social media. I like them too. But more important, I think, to really capitalize on a variety of channels out there, rather than just rely on one or two channels to do this, I think. So.
You guys have any other thoughts on the
I
communication?
guess the thought that I have is that I think when you think about communication, I would be talking about it in a very broad sense. So it is about, yes, what messages do you need to try to get to people and individuals, but also what is the support, like you said, that needs to be around them to be able to have them be able to use those messages. I also have been in public health for a very, very long time, and I was trained to think that public health should be of and by the people and communities, not to and for. So it's not what can we do to you or for you, it's how can we empower you to do something that really helps move your health, your individual health, your family's health, your community's health, et cetera. The thing that I think with the partnerships, and when I was thinking about being here today, the idea that what more can we do to communicate with these other partners that are also interested in sort of social issues, whether it's housing, whether it's employment, whether it's the status of veterans in this country, et cetera. Because if we say that we are concerned as a community or concerned as a public about having healthy, safe housing, for instance, healthy, safe, affordable housing, for instance, I'd like it to be the default that includes tobacco-free. I mean, that to me feels like that should just be the default position. Again, good, solid, reliable employment. I would like to believe that we could get to a place where the standard for that would be tobacco-free, given that we know, even in the worst population groups, we still have the majority of people who do not smoke. And we also know that most people, 9 out of 10 smokers, start before their 18th birthday. So it is really all about this community context and the standard that we're really, I was shocked, and I knew this, but to see it again in writing, to think that there are states and communities, counties in this country that still have schools that allow tobacco use and smoking in schools. And it just, it still means that the standard that that so many of us take for granted is not where we are. So I think in my response to your question, it would be that we really have to also rethink sort of it is about framing it, but it is about communicating the value of tobacco and a no tobacco environment in the context of those other things.
And I might just add that we also have to communicate to varying audiences. So there's the message that you want to give to the youth whom you don't want to start smoking, or the message you want to give to a person who is smoking and needs to quit. But oftentimes, those are not the folks that are voting or making policy decisions. So we have to communicate to our business leaders, our community leaders, our elected officials, and the people who vote for and support them. And oftentimes those folks are not in a smoking environment. They're not poor. They're not seeing so many of the things that we're describing today. So even with the limited resources we have to split our messaging. And we have to realize that people have varying world views. I think Alana mentioned the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and Vish mentioned, communicating in ways that really resonate. And I think the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation did a fabulous job several years back. They developed a toolkit or a guide, if you will, a messaging guide called A New Way to Talk About the Social Determinants of Health. And I latched onto it not so much because it was about social determinants, but just it was about messaging people with very different worldviews. So there's a group of folks who see an individual as part of a system, a family system, a community system, a world, and that things in that system impact that person's behavior. there's a whole other worldview that says everybody's kind of on their own. You're on an individual path and you're experiencing a series of barriers or opportunities, or resources or a lack of resources. And those worldviews require different kinds of messaging, even though at the end of the day, if you sat across a table and you asked people with any of these worldviews, what do you want for the future? They want a future where everybody can be happy and healthy and make good choices and have supportive environments. So, so I think the message framing that Vish talked about, and knowing our audiences and realizing that we can't just focus on smokers or kids who shouldn't start. We have to focus on the entire population and the people who make those decisions.
And in fact, talking about framing too, one of the most, I was going to use a very strong word, I'll be very careful. One of the larger mistakes we have made is to use the term social determinants of health. Think about it. What do people understand by social determinants of health? So number one, it's very abstract. I don't know what it means. Determinants suggest deterministic, that it's immutable. Of course, if it's immutable, we might as well go home. Why are we here, right? We want to change it. It's mutable. We want to address it. These are social drivers of inequalities. These are social drivers of, disparities. Rather than being thoughtful about, how do we choose our, phrases, and framing. Social determinants of health is a very good example of that. By the by, a number of my colleagues have contributed seminally to this work, so I may be getting in trouble with them. But the fact is, and I think we have to be very thoughtful about this kind of a communications in really generating or engendering that kind of a mass movement. So.
And I would also add to one of the state health officials from Tobacco Nation we've had some discussions with, and when we're talking about framing, because we're also doing a study on rural culture and how do you frame things, because when you look at these states, their culture is very different than what we have, for example, in Maryland, or what we have in some of our other very successful states. And this particular state health officer shared with us, please do not use equity as a frame. We can't use equity in our political environment. Please use disparities, because we can talk about disparities with our policymakers. We cannot talk about equity. And so I think having that kind of a sensitivity is also very helpful. And so one of the things that we have learned through this research that we're doing is that people they like the frame improving health and well-being to support economic viability. That has kind of been the frame. And I see all of the discussion that we're having really fitting within that kind of a frame, because frankly, the people in Tobacco Nation, they are not that economically viable. And we just had an interview with also another organization within Tobacco Nation where they had been told that a manufacturer is no longer considering going to their community because they have read so much about the opioid addictions and the high levels of disability and the poor health outcomes, that they do not want to make that investment even though the tax credits are so attractive. So I think we also have to think about how we are framing things so that we can help people be as healthy as they can be, so that their economic viability is in place, so they have good health insurance and can make good decisions, because health literacy also underlies so much of this decision making.
But when you say, when they say please use disparity, don't use equity, can you explain why that is? Is that's like a political?
Yes, the way that he described it to us was that health equity sounds like socialism, that there's something about having equal. Whereas when you talk about disparities, it's easier to sell to policymakers that there is a disparity and we need to address that disparity. And I raise that not because of any of my own personal perspectives, but that I work with a lot of different people, and those of us in public health embrace health equity. However, those that are working at the state and at different policy levels, that frame is not resonating. In fact, it is visceral to them. So thinking about how we can frame issues with regard to health disparities may also help us to better move our work forward.
I think we're almost out of time. I think that was supposed to be my last question, but I do have one last question I really wanted to ask. So a few weeks after I did that one story about disparities, I was asked by Philip Morris. There are people contacted me and said, please come to our office. We have something we want to show you. And it was this new device. It's probably not new to you, this IQOS device. Supposedly it's smoke-free. You insert a little stub that looks like a shortened cigarette into it. And supposedly it won't burn the cigarette. It's a smokeless tobacco that will, I think some of these claims are under challenge, but is significantly healthier, I guess is how they put it. And I wondered about that because in my mind was, the disparities, these more rural, poorer states, and on the other is this future of a healthier cigarette that goes for like $70, $80 for this device. And I'm just curious how you see that playing out. If it really does become a success in US, how does that affect these trends that we're seeing?
Well, I'll just say one thing I think is really important when we kind of go down that road of products that might be less harmful, is that what will really make those work is if we also reduce nicotine to non-addictive levels and if we limit the advertising that can occur and so forth. So I think that while there is promise in some of these various products, other countries are experiencing some success, we still have a lot of research to be done. You can't rely on one of these products alone to take care of the problem. We've got to do some things to make the combustible products much less appealing, much less accessible, and certainly just get rid of them if we can, because the combustible products are absolutely, the most lethal form of tobacco. So that's just my point, is that it really can't be a product in isolation that makes the difference.
And I would just add, just to amplify what Tracy's already said, even the 2014 Surgeon General's report, so the Surgeon General says in that report that alternative products in fact are likely to deliver more positive or be less harmful. But it says it very specifically then within the context of there being either dramatic reductions in the promotion of sales, availability of combustibles, or Tracy said, the reduction of the levels of nicotine. So even the Surgeon General's report has acknowledged there's some potential, but it's the other, the ongoing promotion that still does occur. It's the ongoing political fights that Tracy talked about that are continuing all over the globe. And so it's that we still struggle to, even we support, CDC completely supports FDA's work to look at reducing nicotine in the combustible product. But we also know that to build the science base, to go through the regulatory process, we could be talking about a decade or more, and that's before there might be any litigation or anything else. So, we still strongly believe that in the present moment, while people are still using the combustible product and while people are still dying from the combustible product, we should go back to that vaccine, and we should continue to do the things that we know have been shown to work, do them in the best and most creative way, and get as many partners involved. But we should stick also to the things that we know.
Yeah, I think this is what the industry does, right? Confuse the issue, right? If they are serious, they can do it today. Stop all the opposition to plain paper packaging. Let warning labels be on cigarette packs. We know it works, right? So this is the typical tactics of this big tobacco to sow seeds of doubt, sow seeds of confusion, introduce all these products and say we are trying to address the problem, which is nonsense. That's not what they're doing. They're only creating more problems. If they're so serious, so sincere about this, stop all the activities that you are engaging in, so that we can address the problem, right? So it's only a distraction. So.
I appreciate that. I just want to thank you guys and also welcome Robin back to the stage. Thanks, Robin, for hosting this. This is incredible discussion.
So I think we're going to open it now to the audience for any questions. that you may have. I hope everybody, I was scribbling a lot during the session. Thank you all for some really fascinating points that I'll hope to maybe summarize a little bit at the end, but open it up to everybody else.
Microphones.
Oh, yeah, I think there's microphones in the...
Bunch of hands over here.
Oh, yeah, just feel free to
There's a
grab
microphone.
a microphone, I think.
My name is Shakai Dewey.
Hi.
I'm in the 8th grade, and one of my questions are, where'd they go? What are the different types of tobacco?
I can try to answer the question. I mean, there are different types of tobacco in terms of the leaves and the process and things like that. In terms of the form of tobacco that are most commonly used, and again, I'll even talk about for the young people in the room, when we look at the data that we collect, we're typically asking questions about cigarettes. We're typically asking questions about cigarillos, so the little cigars, which are very concerning because they tend to be flavored, they tend to be very inexpensive, they tend to be sold in very small packaging. So everything that we've done to help bring our initiation rates down around cigarettes, we're not doing right now from a policy standpoint with the little cigars and cigarillos, and we are seeing some uptick in use there. We also look at smokeless. And smokeless was already mentioned in terms of chew, and so there's that form of tobacco comes in a variety of products. You all probably know better than I do what it looks like to walk into any convenience store and see the power wall, is what they call it, of all of the products and all of the types of tobacco that's available. We also look at hookah. So hookah is also a very intense form of consumption of nicotine and tobacco. And then we also look at e-cigarettes. And of course, there had been a very concerning increase in the level of e-cigarette use among youth. And so again, our responsibility is certainly to continue to monitor those trends and monitor that. But thank you for the question. It's great.
Thank you.
I had just a follow-up on that. I know nothing, before I started doing this reporting, I knew nothing about tobacco. I'd smoked once or twice in my life. And in the course of doing this reporting, I came across this one advocate who in his office keeps a library of different forms of tobacco. And it was so fascinating to me to see over the years, any form that would appeal to any person on this planet, they have made it to market. So there were things like bubblegum flavored tobacco products. There were mint strips, like Camel at one point, I don't know when, started putting tobacco and nicotine into mint strips to appeal to people who I guess want better breath and have tobacco at the same time. There's smokeless, there's just an incredible number of forms of tobacco,
Well, and I tell my kids, I mean, the cigarette is one of the most highly engineered devices that you could ever imagine. And the decades of the industry's engineering that so that it's delivering at a very consistent, it's not just, tobacco stuffed in paper and rolled up with it's a highly engineered device. And so there's, the delivery is very deliberate.
We might mention that a lot of times when we talk about e-cigarettes, people think about the liquid, but then the IQOS that you mentioned earlier is actually what they call a heat not burn. So it's not a liquid. It looks like a little stubby cigarette. You put it in a device, and it's an electric device, so it might still qualify as an e-cigarette, but as these products morph, it's kind of hard to tell. So there's all kinds of things.
Hello, my name is Saeed Evans. I have a question when you said about the people in poverty and that are poor, that choose to do bad things. Would that make them to do better and push themselves?
What was the last part of that?
Don't you know how you said when people in poverty, I think they do bad in smoking stuff? Would that to push them not to do some bad stuff?
It's a great question, I think. One of the things that I have been worried throughout this discourse has been, we have been talking about poor, disparities, and it has been a constant source of worry. Are we stigmatizing a group of people It's a classically what they use a phrase called blaming the victims, in the way that, instead of being very sensitive to the issues. That's why I've been trying to draw attention to the issues of social conditions, the social context in which this kind of a behavior takes place. Because it does worry me that by talking about this notion of individuals behaving badly reinforces this opinion that that they're beyond help, it is their fault. I think that's a great question, and I think that's why I think you see all of us being extremely sensitive to the fact it's not the individuals who have to be blamed for this, but it's the larger social conditions, and it's the policies, it's the practices, it's the institutions, it's the companies, it's the schools, and where I think which can play an important role in addressing these individual behaviors.
I think the other thing, and you talked a lot about framing. So for instance, we found on the Truth Campaign, when we're talking to young people, talking about health issues and things like that are, not that important to you when you're 15 years old. It's a long time from now. But when we frame things in terms of things that young people do care about, so we know everybody, young people especially, are concerned about, am I going to be able to make money? Am I going to be able to afford things? When you're a young person and you have no money, you have no ability to go out with your friends. So we've used the fact that smokers make 20% less than non-smokers. There are a lot of reasons for that, but when you're a young person, you think about, well, what are the consequences of making 20% less? I'm stuck at home hanging out with my grandpa on the couch versus being able to go out with my friends, and that resonates. So I think a lot of it is finding a way to put a message out there in the context of what's meaningful to the audience, which is, not telling somebody it's your fault if you smoke and your behavior is wrong, but that there are consequences that maybe do have meaning to you that make the issue seem more relevant.
There's also the elephant in the room, which is, you have the smoker and you have the cigarette, and they chose to smoke it, right? It's their fault. But there's also this elephant in the room, which is this $100 billion of industry that just puts marketing. I think the ads you guys ran last year were especially great about profiling, racial profiling, poverty profiling, where if you go into a neighborhood, a poor neighborhood, there's more retail stores that sell cigarettes per capita than in the richer neighborhoods. Why is that? Because they know this is the target consumer that they want. This is where they're going to get the increase in smoking rates.
Yeah. Exactly. It's having spent a good portion of my life in the marketing world before I did this. If you ask people, are you influenced by ads? They'll always say, oh no, I'm not influenced by any of that. But I mean, what you're speaking to is if marketing works. And obviously $9.6 billion a year has an impact, even if people are not on an individual basis, not realizing that they're being influenced.
Can I add one quick thing, because we haven't brought this up at all? So on the marketing works point, what we also know right now, and confirm this if I am wrong, but is that the tobacco industry spends a vast majority of its marketing budget on price discounts.
Yeah.
Discounting the price through percentage off, 2-for-1s. Think about that. So what is that? What's the reason for that? Because they want, when we do increase the prices, when we do successfully have pricing strategies, they're using their massive resources to undercut those pricing strategies because they know price matters. They know that it actually does help support people who want to quit, and it helps stop people from starting in the first place.
Thank you very much for the panel. I have a question, and it ties to the issue of communication and framing things in different ways. And I have a question for the group. I don't know if last summer, I think it was in July, there was a Reuters report that came out on Philip Morris. And one of the big concerns that Philip Morris had was the integration of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the Global Treaty, in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are the UN global goals that the entire world has agreed to. And a question that I have is, I wonder whether that would be at all helpful or useful in local communities in the United States. For example, would matter in Oklahoma if there was a way of demonstrating that Oklahoma is falling behind global goals when it comes to tobacco control. And I'm curious whether that would be a new and novel ways to frame it in view or comparing it to the Sustainable Development Goals and the tobacco targets. That was one question. And the other one I had is in context of taxes. I know cessation being a key element of it, but those tobacco nations, those are the states where the taxes on cigarettes are the lowest. And I'm wondering to what level is cessation covered? So if I'm a poor smoker with limited income, is it cheaper for me to continue smoking, or will I be able to be treated?
So I probably can't speak for all of Oklahoma or Tobacco Nation on the comparison to underdeveloped countries or others, but I think it all depends on how we message, what exact frame we put it in. Sometimes it matters, sometimes we'll compare ourselves in Oklahoma to Texas around football, and so there are all kinds of ways that you can make comparisons work, but they have to be framed pretty much exactly right. And I've already forgotten what your second.
About the relationship between whether continuing to smoke actually is more cost advantageous and related to the costs and
of quitting
and the resources available to quit.
Well, so almost every state in the nation and every territory, I think, has a quit line. 1-800-QUIT-NOW can get any smoker who wants to quit access at any time. But each state is different in just how many resources they're putting to that and how accessible it is. If they only have a small sliver of money, that quit line might only be available to pregnant women on Medicaid, for example. In Oklahoma, anybody can get help at any time and several times a year. And we have a very robust quit line, but again, we have a revenue stream from the Master Settlement Agreement. So I can't speak to the other states in Tobacco Nation. They're all very different, but at least there is the possibility of free quitting in Oklahoma. But again, that's the quit line. So we do other strategies through health systems, through our Medicaid agency, our Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services to try to help people with quitting. It's not always readily available. As Corinne mentioned, not every provider is doing the right action, the best practices intervention, and we need that to happen. But that alone won't do it either.
I would also add, too, that some of those states are already compared to the bottom of the barrel, if you will. And one of the comments they give us is that we're always at the bottom. And, to have that kind of comparison doesn't really elevate them or motivate them, because on almost every measure that you look at, they are not performing well. So it might be interesting to frame it in a way of positive about how to move and how to become more healthier, to encourage a healthier culture, because it's kind of tough when you're always 50 or 49.
Although, one of the things that I just want to address your statement about, we very rarely look at the state of tobacco control in the United States in comparison to the rest of the world. And there's this sense among many people in tobacco control and outside that we're ahead. And one of the things that we thought in doing this report is that almost appealing to the sense of pride that Americans have, that we are leaders, and we certainly have been leaders in tobacco control, that somehow we've lost our way a little bit, that it might be more valuable, instead of comparing West Virginia to California, and California's on top and West Virginia's on the bottom, to say, look, we have 20% of the United States, 66 million people, who are somehow doing less well than places that we think, with all of our resources, we should be actually the beacon for. And that's one of the purposes that we have here today. So thank you for asking that.
Thank you. First, I want to appreciate you speaking of the elephant in the room when you talked about how the tobacco company chooses to market. I really appreciate that. So working in education, we use data heavily, and data drives instruction. So you all have data, and that's driving, I guess, interventions on what to do next. So speaking from an educator's point of view, where I work in a place where class is definitely evident, and they are marketing heavily to my students. What does, I guess, an educator in these trenches do? Because they are marketing heavily, and I heard of created earnings and revenues for Oklahoma, but how do we, I guess, create that same intervention for where we are? Because it's absolutely true where you are in Northwest and in Northeast and what you see marketed to the different social classes. And I know we're not supposed to literally focus on equity and focus more on disparities, but it is absolutely the truth. And it's very frustrating almost to see the difference in the classes and how the tobacco industry chooses to market heavily for our students and their demographics. And so I guess my main question is, how do we, as we are in the trenches, support our students? Because they are exposed to this every single day, and they do see the adverse reactions within their homes, within their families, within everywhere closely related to them. So I guess we need some help with that, being educators. So that's my main question.
Well, I'll chime in first and just say thank you for being an educator. And yes, absolutely. And I think educators have many opportunities to have an impact. One of them would be for you, for example, to show the youth or have them show you what they're seeing in these retail environments when they walk in, and the push-pull sign looks like a tobacco advertisement, or the change bucket, or there's all the different signs and so forth. Have them do sort of an environmental assessment and show you what it looks like in their community versus what it looks like in another one not too many miles away. Show you the advertisements that they're seeing in magazines, for example. That's a really popular place for the industry to target youth. And they're not necessarily youth magazines, but magazines that have a pretty good youth readership, so I think you have so many examples, and I remember even in Florida when they did their very first major initiative, they developed curriculum from K through 12, and the art class addressed things about advertising, for example. The math class talked about the economic impact of smoking. And the science class talked about how the cigarettes were designed specifically for addiction. So just in pure education terms, I think there are many, many opportunities no matter what subjects you're addressing. And then certainly within your environment in the school, if your school is not tobacco-free, campus, sporting events, off-site events, then get involved and help make that happen and help your youth make that happen. When the youth begin to see these things, when it's pointed out, we've had youth cleaning up a park and bringing all the tobacco trash in an acrylic jug to either a school district or a city council or whatever. Youth are powerful, powerful advocates because they then shine a light on what our adult world brings to them. And I just applaud you and really thank you very much for bringing that up.
I think there are two answers to your question. I think one is what you can do within the school, and the other is what should be done outside the school. I think, right? It's time we take education seriously in this country. In terms of investment. If you go and look at some of these other countries, someone mentioned Sustainable Development Goals earlier. The tremendous attention that people are paying to education in a number of other countries does not mirror here in this country what we are trying to do. I mean, we hear routinely stories about teachers paying out of their own personal pocket to supply, to buy school supplies, which is just an abysmal issue, right? It's a shame, right? And so I think it's time we invest seriously in our schools. And I think as a part of that process, investment is, and I think the point is very good. I was thinking of that. If we can provide you with the resources, we may be able to integrate a tobacco type curriculum, health curriculum within everything, mathematics, economics, science, politics. We should be able to do that, I think, curriculum. But also I think the larger issue is you can't do everything on your own if we fail to invest in families, if we fail to invest in the neighborhoods, if we fail to enforce laws at the local communities, we have shown with, I think, some of the studies that you funded for us, where advertising is on the gas stations, on the pumping stations, right? You can obviate all the rules doing that kind of a thing. So if we have to really, as a society, look at outside the schools and can't put all the burden on our educators to do this kind of stuff, So.
Well, good morning. My name is Lynn Gober. I am the science teacher of these magnificent students. I just want to initially thank the Truth Initiative. This is my second year in a row of being here. And Mr. Wong, my question is definitely for you. I want to know, how can you help us and help the students begin to write articles with the Washington Post and the kids page in reference to the communication that the young lady in Oklahoma talked about? Because everything she said, I've already written how we can put together a workshop that we would like to involve our Friendship Public middle school students within, because they do need to start now to understand how the impact of cigarette smoking, even secondhand cigarette smoking, has an impact on their life, that because they will be the adults of the future. So we need that. And again, I want to thank Ms. Robin for this opportunity. And it's very important for them to know that our adults really care about their future. So thank you so much for this opportunity.
I would love to talk to you after. I'm really interested in doing something with you guys. Yeah, that would be really great. Because I mean, the students themselves are the best communicators for their age group, for their peers, for the message. Like, a student talking about this beats anything any organization can do, So.
Well, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you, William, for a great panel. Corinne, Vish, Alana, Tracy. I hope all of you are inspired by what we've talked about today. You'll all be getting copies of Tobacco Nation. This is the start of a conversation. We depend on all of you to help spread the word, and I hope you will. There is so much more work to be done. I am leaving here with a whole list of things that we're going to start doing at the end of this. And I just thank you all, and I invite you to lunch and to more networking, and we'll see you here again soon for another Warner series. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for being here.